Hello, my name is Dr. Kathleen Sarmiento. I'm currently the SAP counselor at Ramona High School. And I just first want to say that I know it's been really hard having to adjust with this current pandemic. I wanted to make sure that I took some time to talk to you about trauma. So defining what trauma is, as well as what happens in our bodies when we experience trauma and how we're going to get through this traumatic pandemic. Because a lot of times we don't identify this current pandemic that we're experiencing as traumatic. I'll also be going over a couple things that you can try, and I really want to make sure that you're aware that we do need to be prepared for the psychological impact that this crisis may have caused for not only ourselves, but for our students. Our world has been socially isolated, and we've been experiencing dramatic and rapid losses in our lives right now. And it's all while having little preparation for a crisis of this magnitude. I would claim that we are not ready for the mental health consequences of this crisis either. And the stress, the anxiety, and fear that have been a part of this pandemic, along with the global loss of isolation required to combat what's going on, is probably going to bring out a numerous amount of cases that have caused psychological trauma as well as post-traumatic stress disorder. So I wanted to get into defining what trauma is. And trauma can be defined as unexpected death, physical, sexual, emotional abuse, as well as neglect, witnessing or experiencing domestic violence, as well as natural disasters, serious illnesses or accidents, loss of family members, and members being deployed or refugee war experiences, and there's several more. A lot of times we don't really think about or define certain things as trauma when they actually really can be or are. So some of these are also considered ACE scores. So if you haven't heard about ACEs, what ACEs means is adverse childhood experiences. So why this is relevant is because if you have more ACEs that you've experienced in your youth, that adds a higher risk level to your physical and mental health problems as an adult. So it's really important to think about that as well. Sometimes we think about trauma and we don't realize that if someone has had a lot of trauma in their lives or traumatic experiences, they can go one of two ways. Either they put themselves in more risky situations because they don't really identify or define things as traumatic because they're used to experiencing trauma, and so they're at higher risk, or you are heightened to identifying things that aren't really as intense or traumatic. You identify that as being traumatic. So with trauma, you also have to remember that for us to consider it trauma, a lot of times it can be something that we're witnessing rather than experiencing ourselves. So an example that I can give is if two people are witnessing the same car accident and so there's a fatality, someone might interpret that as something extremely traumatic, while the other person witnessing it might not see it as something traumatic. So that's some of what you can tell is a difference between someone experiencing an event versus being in that event. So obviously the person that's in the car, that's in the accident, with someone that dies, or if they are the person that gets seriously injured, they can be having certain signs and symptoms because of that traumatic experience. So with that, I do want to get into talking about how we experience trauma in our bodies. So what I'll start with first is anxiety. And anxiety is a specific feeling of fear or dread. It may not have a known trigger either. So anxiety can also stem from chronic stress.
The way we experience anxiety in our bodies, for example, how we cope with this current pandemic, can be the same as how we experience very distinct fears, such as fear of dogs, spiders, or flying. The amygdala is a primary structure in our limbic system and is the emotional center of the brain. You may have heard of the amygdala, called our brain's watchdog. Once the brain has encountered a threat in the amygdala, whether actual or perceived, it releases a surge of chemicals like cortisol and norepinephrine. These chemicals give us a natural boost in reflex time, perception, and speed, which activates our sympathetic nervous system. This causes our hearts to pump faster in order to get more blood and oxygen circulating throughout our bodies. We essentially go into survival mode. Some of our physical symptoms include sweaty palms, shallow breathing, feeling like we need to urinate, our pupils dilating, mouth getting dry, blood pressure rises, digestion slows, and blood flows outward towards our major muscle groups. This is where our bodies then go into fight, flight, or freeze mode, which our body does as a response to a perceived threat. We either run away, freeze, or fight. However, with this current pandemic, the stress and anxiety might be consistent within our bodies due to all of the news and media consistently around us. The best way, however, to protect your brain and body from the effects of chronic stress and anxiety is to find a way to manage it before it begins to affect your health. One major thing to consider and try would be to take a break from social media, including watching television. Even if you allow yourself 1 to 2 hours a day of social media, it can help, and it allows your brain to take a break. Another major thing you can do is right before you go to sleep, journal your experience. This will give you something to look back on later in life and see how you really got through this. Please remember, we are all resilient. If you journal before you go to sleep, this can help you with some of your anxiety that you might be experiencing that's keeping you up at night as well.
All right. For now, you can try or suggest some of these tools that have been discussed in order to get your body back to utilizing the parasympathetic nervous system. So the parasympathetic nervous system is what controls homeostasis in the body, and that means that everything is working at optimal efficiency. People often are really hard on themselves when they're experiencing or going through, or as well as coping with, a trauma. We tend to downplay our emotions, especially if they're intense, and we're telling ourselves a lot of the time that it's not okay to feel this way. Please don't do that. Try to do the opposite and be kind to yourself more, and also accept that it's okay to have these emotions. Your emotions are valid. And if you do this and you're able to do this, it can really decrease your likelihood for these emotions really affecting you in a negative way later on. If you notice somebody that is also in shock or have come out of denial, please try to support them as well. You'd be amazed at how much that can build your own resiliency when you're dealing with trauma. And we call this co-regulating. I know I told you a lot of information. I really appreciate you sticking in there with me to go over some of this. Our next meeting is on May 6th, either at the 9 o'clock or the 3 o'clock as an option. And what I want you to do before those meetings is really reflect on how you're doing, how you've been feeling, and how you've been taking care of yourself. And if you have any questions, please make sure you write them down or be ready to ask them so we can discuss some of that. So thank you so much, and I really appreciate you taking time to listen to this information.